know, the classical, like, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction.
Because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
If people don't understand that so much of what they believe is actually a result of how integrating those beliefs makes you behave and makes you feel, if people think that they're acting purely rationally, that every single decision they make about their worldview and their opinions about the world are purely sort of analytical, syllogistic reasoning, then I think they're either telling the truth, in which case they're missing something incredibly important about the human experience, or they don't realize just how much their emotional states are creeping into their rational thought.
You are infamously began your career on the internet as a new atheist firebrand, kind of the youngest of the lot. And at the same time, you seem to have a almost religious fervor for the Bible and Christianity. What is it that obsesses you about the Bible and the Christian mythology?
The Christians will tell you it's the Christian equivalent of what the Muslims call fitra, the sort of inherent desire or drive that a person is born with towards God, and that I'm being sort of whispered to and through the scripture. I don't think it's that, partly because I'm so critical of the text. It is the only ancient text with which I have enough familiarity to talk about meaningfully. Some people get obsessed with the Odyssey or Metamorphosis or something. And I think part of the interest is, can we be sure that Homer wrote this? You know, can we figure out why? Can we figure out how people interpreted the story at the time? Did the Greeks really believe in the existence of their gods? These are interesting questions, but questions that I don't really have anything to say about because I don't know their stories very well. With the Bible, I spent so long in the new atheist school of thinking that religion is harmful and definitely untrue that I learned a thing or two about the Bible.
But even, I would say, more than that, you studied theology.
That's true.
So that's taking a big step other than becoming vaguely familiar with the Gospels.
But, you know, like there's a level to which when you are in the new atheist sort of firebrand spirit, you think, okay, I'm going to learn about this religion because I want to have better discussions and better debates. And then something shifts and I'm like, look, it's so simplistic to say religion is bad. I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. Kind of makes sense. And you could make some case. You could give some grand speech saying politics, it drives families apart. And can you name one war that wasn't caused by politics? It's so terrible. And that's kind of true, but it seems trivially true. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. And it doesn't mean that you should abstain from doing politics.
Or that humanity needs politics to a certain level, to a certain degree. We have to govern and we have to find discourse and ways to legislate.
So I think it's pretty naive. And then I'm left in a position where I no longer think I can make this surface level simplistic firebrand atheist case, but I also am now just really interested in the Gospels. Because once you've spent so long learning about this kind of stuff, when somebody comes along and says, hey, have you ever noticed this about the text? It just is interesting to me because this is something that I've known about for years, and here's something new that I'm discovering. So I just fell into this, I don't know, the only way I can describe it is a bit like how people get interested in all kinds of texts. People have their favorite play or something like that.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I find that a little disingenuous that you're saying the reason I'm interested in the Gospels is it's the thing I'm the most familiar with. I could be familiar with the work of,
In fairness, there aren't like
Zarathustra or the Epic of Gilgamesh or something, but
there aren't world religions that have sprung up that are as relevant to the people I interact with today around something like the
So there's a certain level of relevance to it as well.
Because also, I do philosophy more broadly. I talk about ethics. I talk about free will. I talk about all of this kind of stuff. And in doing that, people always come to the table with religion. It always comes up. You're talking about the big questions with people. Around half of them are probably going to be religious. And some of them are going to be Christian. And I just find these conversations so interesting
It's fascinating talking about this with you. Really, I'm truly fascinated, and I love getting a non-Christian's perspective on the gospel, because I try and dive in occasionally on my own and understand it, and it's so difficult to separate it from canon.
Yeah, and please take my
interpretation.
words with a pinch of salt.
Sure.
Your listeners should, like, if I've said something that's an egregious error, don't blame Rain. I'm just a guy. I'm just an atheist.
We're having
a
conversations. What do I know? I'm just a stupid sitcom actor. But I did want to pick your brain about atheism. And I know right now I would call you kind of a spiritual atheist. Is such a thing possible? Can one be a spiritual atheist?
Sure.
How would that work?
I'm never quite sure what someone means by spiritual. Like, do you mean like has a spirit or believes that?
An atheist that incorporates kind of transcendent emotions into a larger kind of heart-based compassion.
I would say
into their belief structure and way of living.
I leave room for it. I don't believe in anything transcendent of the material, but I haven't ruled it out, and I'm not a materialist in the sense of saying there is only the material.
Are you now considering yourself an agnostic?
Yeah, I think that's
is that a cop out? A lot of people would say, like, Sebastian Junger came on the show and he's like, it's a bullshit cop out. You're either an atheist or you're a theist. Of course there's an agnostic. We can't know anything. We can't know any truth. What do you think?
Cognitive science has shown for decades that belief isn't purely rational. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, thinking proves that most decisions start with fast, emotional instincts, and then we rationalize them afterward. Religious faith works the same way. It appeals to feelings of comfort and belonging. Neuroscience studies even show that prayer and worship activate the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine, which reinforces belief whether or not it's true. History backs this up too. Christianity itself absorbed myths and customs from earlier religions. Christmas falls near the Roman festival of Saturnalia, and the story of a dying and rising savior parallels older myths like Osiris and Mithras. Even within the Bible, contradictions reveal human authors, not divine truth. The Gospels can't agree on Jesus' genealogy, Matthew 1 versus Luke 3. Luke 3, or what happened at the resurrection. So Alex is right. Our worldviews aren't cold logic. They're shaped by emotional and cultural forces. That's why Christianity spread, not because it proved God exists, but because it resonated with human psychology and borrowed from traditions that came before. Once you see that, its clear belief is about human needs, not divine truth.
Well, I've heard people say that, and usually it's an atheist of the type of Christopher Hitchens who wants to say that, agnostics are just atheists without a backbone or something. It's like, okay, man, I still don't know if God exists. Like, that is just true. I don't know. It would be maybe a cop-out if I was intentionally, calling myself one just for, better PR or something. But if anything, it has the opposite effect, because I get a lot of flack for not being too, firm in a position. As I like to say, I will die on this fence. I think it is the most reasonable position to hold, especially because there are so many levels of agnosticism. It's like, okay, is it that you don't know? Is it that you think that it's unknowable? Because it could be that, I'm agnostic about whether it's raining outside. Yeah. But I believe we could go and find out with a little bit of effort if it's raining outside. But there's a kind of agnosticism which says you can't know. Right? So I could be an agnostic in the sense, some random uncle of mine or something who's never really thought about theology would probably say, if I were to ask, yeah, I guess I'm an agnostic, I don't know. But that's just because, I haven't looked at the arguments. If I have a look, I'll figure it out. There are others who have studied all of the arguments, still say they're agnostic, but because they think you won't be able to get to an answer, right? And it's a difference saying, I just don't know and I can't know. Mm-hmm. But there's also an agnosticism that comes about as not knowing what someone's talking about. Do you believe in God? I was like, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? Really? It's that annoying Petersonian question, but you need to know. The classical, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. Mm-hmm. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction. But if you think that God is just being, then you could, as an atheist, be like, yeah, okay, well, I believe that stuff exists, and I guess that makes me a pantheist or something. And it all starts getting muddy and confused.
Sure.
So it's like, okay.
We talked about this before in the limitations of language.
Yeah, it's like ask me Like, define the thing you want to know if I believe in, and ask me if I believe in it, and I will tell you to the best of my ability whether I can or I can't. But if somebody says that agnosticism is just a cop-out, well, I think that's a rhetorical cop-out. I think they're just sort of saying something that's a bit sort of spicy and fun and makes you sound like an edgy atheist, but is actually indicative of either not understanding or purposefully misrepresenting the position of the agnostic.
Now, you said before that you don't believe in anything beyond the material.
Mm.
And in our previous conversation, I described kind of my definition of God as being much more akin to something like beauty or truth or even love. Have you ever been in love?
Yeah.
You've been in love. You've felt deep love for a partner, a romantic partner?
Yeah.
And have you felt it for a family member?
Yeah. I mean, one always wants to say, I think so, because I imagine that, for example, when you have a child
I feel
for the first
so.
time, and yeah, that's the problem, isn't it?
Okay.
But I can kind of imagine
think that you have felt love, but you don't know that you've felt it on the kind of a level of like having a child or something like that.
That's what I mean. It's like, I'm sure that when you have a child, it
changes the paradigm.
I had a Christian friend who recently had a child and said that having a child made them suddenly understand not the sacrifice of Jesus as sacrificing himself, but the sacrifice of the Father sacrificing his only son. He was like, I've just unlocked this whole new understanding of what it means to love a son that you've
I had a
forgotten.
new understanding of God and the divine when I had a child. I didn't have it. My wife had it, and my wife and my child almost died in childbirth. And it was a horrific story, and it was in the middle of the night in a hallway in the emergency room in a hospital in Van Nuys, California. It was utter childbirth nightmare that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Everyone survived. It came out great. And I held my son in one of the most profound moments of my life in this hallway at 4 a.m., having him almost die and being brought back from death. And there I was, and I looked him in the eyes, and I felt a kind of love on a level that I had never experienced before. And it made me understand God in a different way, because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
Yeah.
Because when you love this child so much, of course there are consequences to behaviors. You know, when my son did some nefarious activities here and there in his teenage years, there were consequences to it, but the love never wavered. And the idea of some kind of like undying punishment from me to this beautiful little creature that had come into the world was beyond the possibility. And then I'm just a unemployed sitcom actor with a mediocre podcast. What do I know? Let alone the divine being, Father, creator of love itself. How much love, how much intimacy, closeness, and light does this, this essence hold us all? The idea of like some kind of punishment or smiting then just becomes ludicrous. So it did, for me, shift my perspective of the divine. Does that make sense?
And there are things which experience gives you that you just can't quite put into words. I mean, William James famously tried to sort of analyze what religious experience is, and he comes up with these, I think there are like 4 qualities, and one of the qualities of religious experience is its ineffability. You cannot put it into words. You can't explain it. It's something that you literally just can't explain. It's like taking psychedelics, right? If you take psychedelics, and you try to explain what it's like, you can kind of get halfway there, but there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
I heard in an interview that you did, and I was listening to a clip of it, and you were talking about, like, imagine someone trying to write an essay about the color blue.
Yeah.
You could know a little bit. It could give you some clues into the color blue, but if you'd never seen color before, and you grew up in a gray room, or you were colorblind or whatever, and all of a sudden you had access to color, seeing the color blue is a very different experience than reading about the color blue.
Yeah, this is a thought experiment called Mary's Room. So you imagine Mary in this room, but you can make it even worse, because you can say, imagine that Mary in this black and white room that she's born in has access to everything that ever even could be written or uncovered or understood about the color blue. All the science that we yet to discover, all the color theory, everything that could even be known. She has it all written down. She studies it all. And then she steps outside and she sees something blue. The question is, does she learn something? And it seems like the answer is yes. And if that's the case, then there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
When Alex says he'll die on the fence as an agnostic, he's actually pointing to one of the strongest philosophical positions. We don't know, and maybe we can't know. Even Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnostic in the 19th century, argued that intellectual honesty requires admitting limits to human knowledge. Science supports this. The Mary's Room thought experiment in philosophy of mind shows that no matter how much you know about an experience, you can't fully understand it without living it. That doesn't mean the supernatural is real. It just means human brains process knowledge differently when tied to emotion and perception, and religious experiences don't prove a God. Neuroscience shows that love, awe, and mystical states all arise from brain activity. Experiments with psychedelics like psilocybin reliably trigger feelings of unity, transcendence, or divine presence, the same sensations people attribute to God. In fact, Andrew Newberg's brain scans of praying nuns and meditating monks revealed predictable neurological patterns, not evidence of heaven. Even the Bible contradicts the idea of an all-loving God revealed through experience. Exodus 34:7 describes God punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Compare that to Jesus' teaching of unconditional forgiveness, and you see human authors projecting different experiences of love, fear, and control, not a consistent divine truth.
That is best.
And love is like that.
And that points us to love, because I think that love is the greatest kind of analogy to God. And you said, I don't believe in anything kind of transcendent beyond the material. Do you believe that love is merely kind of neurons and endorphins in the brain, united with some kind of DNA kind of like impetus towards propagation of the species?
Now, that's a genuine mystery, because I think that's tied up to the question of consciousness more broadly. I don't have any problem saying that the experience of love is something like a feeling. It's something that you very strongly feel. And so if you're going to be a materialist about consciousness in general, you can say that love is just one of those feelings that is neurons in the brain. But not specific to love, just specific to feeling anything. I find it very strange to say that not that the feeling of love or the seeing of blue is correlated with brain activity, but that is the brain activity. That love is the same thing as the neurons firing in my brain when I feel love. I'm not interested in what the brain's doing. I'm interested in the experience that correlates with that brain activity. You know, if the experience of seeing blue is just neurons firing in my brain, if that's what blue is, I should be able to cut open your brain and find blue in there somewhere, but you can't. There's something called blue, this experience that you have, which goes alongside the brain activity, but is not the same thing as it. That is the greatest mystery for materialists to explain, which is why I'm agnostic. That's why I say I leave room for this. I don't say I'm a materialist. The biggest challenge for that is consciousness.
Well, one of the biggest disservices that atheists, I feel, do to themselves and to their cause, because atheists can be extremely evangelical, is this idea that consciousness is an illusion. You know, it's the Daniel Dennett kind of thing. Like we're getting all of these inputs, and our brain makes them become a totality of experience, but it's all illusory, including emotion. And that free will is also an illusion, but that, you know, between our DNA and between our neurons firing and our background and our B.F. Skinner kind of behavioralist way that we've grown up in our culture, you know, any choice that we're seeming to make has actually been pre-wired into our cognition. But if atheists hold to consciousness is an illusion and there's no such thing as free will, you're not going to gain a lot of converts. Because if you go to a random house over here in Thousand Oaks, California.
Have you heard the bad news?
Like, hey, by the way, guys, your experience of being a human being, memories and growing up and falling in love and breaking your leg and losing your uncle and seeing the the Mona Lisa for the first time. By the way, that's all an illusion.
Yeah.
And in fact, you didn't even really experience that. And you didn't even choose to go to Italy and go see the Mona Lisa. That was all chosen for you in a variety of different ways. You're not really doing yourselves any favor by gaining people over to the atheist bandwagon.
The few issues I'd have to raise to that, though, are firstly that truth doesn't have to be palatable, right? If it is actually the case, you might not have many converts to it, but if it is the case, then it just is the case. Also, some people will say that
Christians would say the same thing.
That's true, but that's the thing.
Burning in hell may not be palatable, but it doesn't convert people, right? Exactly. But it's true.
And so I think, the kind of atheist materialist you're talking about would say the same thing. Technically speaking, you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist, because atheism is being without God.
Yep.
You could believe that there's an immaterial existence. You could believe in mind-body dualism, but not believe that there's a God, for example. That's another important thing to spell out. But yeah, I mean, the idea that consciousness is an illusion, I think, is pretty confused. Having said that, I haven't thought about this as much as Daniel Dennett has, so I have to temper my words. But I really think that that's almost a contradiction in terms. There's also another sort of element that's missing from this picture. We talk about there only being the material, or there being the material, but also this like mind stuff, this immaterial thing. There's also a position that there's only the mind stuff and that the material doesn't exist.
Oh, that's good. I know my friend Stephen Phelps is out there watching, and he's all in favor of that.
Yeah.
Right? You lit up like a Christmas tree. He's so happy right now.
So they call it idealism, at least in one of its forms.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that.
So it's kind of mysterious how materialists account for consciousness, but they say, like, in some way, the conscious experience is just emergent of material properties. And the idealist says that the material world is emergent of a mind. So George Berkeley is sort of the classic philosopher to think about here. He starts by sort of asking the reader to be like, it's impossible to separate the thing from your idea of the thing, right? Like if you try to imagine a tree that's just on its own somewhere in a forest, you've got the concept in your mind. The thing that's in your mind is the concept of the tree. It's not you don't have a material tree in your mind. It's the concept. And like your sense experience, you're only seeing a representation of what's in front of you.
Is that kind of like Plato's forms, like the ideal form?
Plato is sort of abstracting from objects to understand why this is a cup and that's also a cup. What is it they have in common? They're far apart from each other. They're different colors. They're different shapes. What is it they have in common? Well, they both share in this abstract thing called a form. That's a whole other thing, which I also think kind of maybe points to consciousness, but that's really interesting. But no, Berkeley is talking about you can't think of a thing without thinking of the thing, right? Nothing exists except insofar as it's being thought about. Now, I think there are so many holes to poke in this, but this is Berkeley's position. So he's like, when you see a table, you're just seeing your mind's representation of the table. You don't see the table directly. Same thing like Kant points out, you don't have direct access to the table. It's through your experience. Okay, well, the same thing with anything, and the critic says, well, I can conceive of a cup just existing on its own. And Berkeley's like, yeah, but you're conceiving of it. And so what you're imagining is a thought. So here comes the objection to this position. Aha, okay, well, Mr. Berkeley, if I have a candle and I light the candle and I look at it and then I leave the room and I don't think about it, no one's thinking about the candle, and yet I come back and the candle has melted. There must have been a time in between where the candle existed, but no one was thinking about it. So it existed separate from thought. And Berkeley says, I still think that things only exist insofar as they're being thought about. But what you've just proven is that there is always some kind of mind thinking about everything all at once.
Ooh.
And that's what God is for George Berkeley.
Interesting.
So Berkeley thinks that God exists and the entire material universe is like a thought of God, which is kind of interesting. The Plato's form thing is interesting because there is this great mystery. Why is this a cup? Why is that a cup? Why is this a table and this not a table? It's actually a really difficult question to answer.
When people say love proves God, they're confusing emotion with evidence. Neuroscience is clear. Love is a product of brain chemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin drive bonding between partners, parents, and children. These chemicals evolved to help humans survive and pass on their genes, not to reveal the divine. The fact that we feel love so powerfully doesn't mean it comes from outside the material. It means our brains are wired for it. Consciousness is often called the hard problem, but that mystery doesn't point to God either. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland argue that consciousness emerges from complex neural networks, just like flight emerges from wings. We don't need a supernatural soul to explain experience. And history shows that claims about consciousness as proof of God shift with time. Augustine said it was the soul. Descartes said it was dualism. Today, neuroscience shows its electrochemical activity. Each step shrinks the role of God. Even Berkeley's idea that the universe only exists because God is thinking it falls apart. Physics shows the universe operated for billions of years before humans, or any minds, were here to perceive it. Cosmic background radiation, fossil records, and planetary evolution all prove that matter existed long before thought. So love, consciousness, and philosophy don't point to God. They point to the complexity of the human brain. The beauty of agnosticism and atheism is that it allows us to admit what we don't yet know without inventing a supernatural answer. What do you think? Does love prove God? Or is it just chemistry and evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you perspective, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy, science, and belief.
Alex, why are you an atheist then?
Well, beautifully put, as always, Trent. Although there are more than two things that amaze me when I look around the world or capture my imagination, let's say. Of course, the stars at night are incredible. The moral feeling that every person intuitively has, except maybe a few eccentric examples of human beings who don't appear to have that within them. These are amazing, but what also captivates me in the nature of our human experience is the depth of suffering to which we're all capable of sinking. I think that suffering in many ways defines the human experience, and certainly the experience of non-humans, such that I know people who will go their entire life saying that they've never really experienced any real pleasure. Their whole life has been a misery. But you'll never find a person who says that their entire life they haven't had any real pain and suffering. This is something that equally needs to be accounted for. Now, to me, I said this in a conversation that I had with Trent and the others yesterday. The problem of evil, as it's famously formulated against the existence of a good God, is usually thought of as a response to religion, as a response to the existence of a God. You have this construct, you have this idea of an afterlife and of ethics and of a perfectly good being. And then you look around you at the immeasurable levels of suffering that we experience, the nihilism, the pointlessness, the pain. And we say this causes a problem, it's a response to it. But I think this is exactly the wrong way around. I think that the suffering came first, the nihilism came first, and that religion itself is a response to this. And so if you're wondering why it is that, of course, when you look at the nature of our human experience, why is it that we have this wonderful thing that seems to just explain it all away and give us a kind of comfort that we so desperately need? Well, maybe that's because it was how it was designed. The greatest accounts of nihilism and pain and suffering and of reaching out to God and finding no answer can be found in religious scripture. You can find in the book of Job the experience of a man who is suffering and doesn't know why. You can find in Ecclesiastes the lambastation at the meaninglessness of existence, the toiling and the toiling to no end, the fact that eventually all of our achievements will be given to somebody who is unworthy of them when we die and have to pass everything we have on to another person. And the book of Ecclesiastes ends with saying, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That is, you have pages and pages and pages of nihilistic outcry. Somebody saying they just cannot understand why everything is so meaningless. They cannot live a meaningful life. They cannot find pleasure and joy in anything. And the conclusion of this is fear God and follow his commandments. It's kind of tacked on at the end there. The author of Ecclesiastes, the person who wrote it, is reporting the words of somebody else, Kohelet, who is the one who's the nihilist. And at the very end of this, the author adds on their own addendum where they say, therefore, fear God and keep his commandments. And what does this say to us? It says to us that maybe this is just a way to escape the suffering. Maybe we just all recognize that we've been dropped into this completely ununderstandable circus of pain and torment and confusion, and we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea where we got here, and it's terrifying. It's scary. And so we come up with a way to try to console ourselves in this situation. Now, if we look at how suffering is embedded into not just the human experience, as I say, but also the non-human experience, then we can ask a simple question. What would we expect to see if Christianity were true? What would we expect to see? How would we expect life to have evolved? What would we expect people's interactions to be like? And if we assumed atheism, again, if we assumed, as I said earlier, that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms who just find themselves in a situation where they need to compete for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? We find a system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, which is not, it doesn't just entail, but is based upon suffering and death. Survival of the fittest entails the death and destruction and suffering of the unfit. 99% plus of all the species who've ever existed on this planet have been brutally wiped from existence, even within the history of our own species. We've got all kinds of sufferings involved in its development throughout its history. Now, this kind of stuff is embedded into the very machinery by which God chose to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained by Christianity. Of course, you could say that maybe this is all part of some grand plan. Maybe the suffering is compensated for in the afterlife. Maybe animals do go to heaven after all, and it just kind of makes up for all the suffering that they're forced to undergo. I'm not going to say this is impossible, but I'm going to ask you what you think is more plausibly the case if we assume either hypothesis. What would you expect to see? I don't think we'd expect to see anything like this if we assumed that there was a benevolent invigilator. But as I say, if we assume atheism, not only do we explain what we see in the world, but we also come to expect it. I think it's a much better account. This is the problem of evil. Now, there's another argument, or another consideration, which is sometimes thought of as a subset of the problem of evil, and that's the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, then why is he so hidden from so many of us, so much of the time, even from those who so desperately seek his attention? Of course, there are people who are what J.L. Schellenberg has called resistant non-believers. They don't believe in God, probably through something of their own fault. Maybe they're resisting in some sense. Maybe they're they're blinding themselves to the evidence. Maybe they're really unwilling to approach the question honestly. Maybe they don't want it to be true and wouldn't accept it even if it were true. Lots of people like this do exist, of course. But as long as there is one example of somebody who honestly seeks God, wants to enter into a relationship with God, and has refused it, there's a problem here. How can this be explained? Schellenberg formalizes the problem as saying, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, it would follow that there is no God.
If you start from the idea that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, then the reality of the world doesn't add up. Evolution isn't a clean or kind process. It's brutal. According to the journal Nature, over 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. Most died out through famine, disease, predation, or environmental collapse. And suffering isn't just a human condition. It's embedded in the biology of life. For example, parasites like Loa Loa, a worm that painfully burrows through the human eye, serve no moral or spiritual lesson. They exist because nature is indifferent, not because it's guided by love. The theological excuse that suffering builds character doesn't apply to animals who live and die in agony or children born with terminal illnesses. And if God wants a relationship with us, why is his presence less obvious than gravity or sunlight? Studies in cognitive science, like those by Justin Barrett, show religious belief may be an evolved byproduct of our pattern-seeking brains, not evidence of divine truth. In this light, atheism doesn't just explain the suffering, it explains why belief itself exists. Christianity starts with an answer and tries to fit the world into it. Atheism starts with the world as it is.
So the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene? I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset really of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. animal pain is bad, not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen, like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue. Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it. Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, here's this circle. He could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff? And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others. For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively, in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom. And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign, I'm kind of skeptical that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real. So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it is to make it simple, is that, look, if we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things, who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist, and the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in a situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in. But I actually want to imagine that you see a parent who, and maybe you don't know anything about dentistry, maybe you're from an isolated tribe or something, and you see a parent kind of taking these sharp objects and digging into a child's mouth, and you think, oh, this looks pretty bad. Someone explains to you about dentistry, and you think, okay, right, so there's good reason for the parent to be inflicting this kind of suffering. Now, if we consider the kinds of suffering that we see across the natural world, We're not just talking about these kinds of cases of obvious benefit or menial suffering. We're talking about deep, intense, unimaginable suffering. So now imagine that you were walking along a road and you saw a parent just mercilessly beating up a child, just ripping the child limb from limb, just punching it, like contorting it out of shape. And you said, this is terrible, this is disgusting, and we need to intervene. And I said to you, well, look, hold on a second. You accepted that a parent might have good reason to inflict suffering on their child if there's good justifiable reason. And if you're willing to accept it for these kinds of suffering, why wouldn't you accept it for this kind of suffering? It's at least plausible they have good reason. Maybe there is some kind of reason that we are just incapable of understanding about their relationship, where this is something that needs to be done and is morally justifiable. But I don't think it just follows from the fact that we can imagine some circumstances in which the infliction of suffering would be permitted by a good God, that we should just hypothesize that even if we see a great deal of apparently meaningless suffering, we should just conclude on the basis of that yeah, he probably has good reason for that too. I just don't think that follows.
Well, I think my reply to that would be, if I saw a parent engage in terrible abuse of a child, I have background knowledge to know what human parents are and are not capable of to contribute to the well-being of a child. And so a parent who is dismembering or eviscerating a child, I have sufficient background knowledge, given what human parents are, to know they cannot be contributing to the child's well-being. And also comparing it to a reference class, unfortunately well populated by parents who are abusive towards their children, and that this parent belongs to that reference class. But with God, however, if God exists, then I know that he is not limited in power or knowledge to bring about greater goods. He's not limited like a human parent in that regard. And then also, so the argument that you make, it is subject to a modus tollens, to a reversal. It's essentially saying, if gratuitous evils exist, God does not exist. Gratuitous evils exist, therefore God does not exist. But if God does exist, it just turns out the evils are only apparently gratuitous. And so that will come down to our position we're in. But I also think that God's ability, when we look at the world also, when we talk, I think this is also important to bring up when we talk about the world, right? Like when you look at the world, when I look at the world, what do we expect? The world, like right now, the world, it's like it's like a slice of what we're looking at. Like the world is this 4-dimensional block. Imagine like the world is not just like right now. It's like the whole thing. And so under the Christian view, it's like there's a beginning of it, there's a trial period. The Catechism talks about it journeying to perfection. And then there is an unending, and this end of the block has no end. And it's reached perfection. So then we've discussed this before, and I apologize if it feels like we're going to tread ground we've already tread, but we have new people listening, which is good. One could ask the question, is it better if God exists, would it be the case he would only create a world we call perfect? Or would he create a world that journeys to perfection? And I would say a world that journeys to perfection would actually be somewhat expected, because it has more goods in it. It has the goods of perfection, and then the other goods that lead up to that, like goods you can only have that are associated with evils, like compassion, courage, forgiveness, things like that.
Trent says God might have hidden reasons for allowing evil and suffering. But that's not a valid explanation. It's just appealing to mystery to cover up contradictions. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, the existence of gratuitous suffering that serves no purpose, is incompatible with that claim. And we can prove gratuitous suffering exists. Take childhood bone cancer. It causes months of pain, often ends in death, and affects kids too young to grow in virtue. What purpose does that serve? Evolution by natural selection doesn't require purpose. It just explains this suffering as part of a blind, unguided process. According to pediatric cancer statistics from the American Cancer Society, around 10,000 children are diagnosed with cancer in the US every year, and many die. If a human let this happen with the power to stop it, we'd call them evil. But with God, we call it mysterious? Second, Trent compares cognitive freedom to moral freedom. But people don't choose to disbelieve. Studies in psychology, like those by Aronor and Zion, show that belief in God is heavily influenced by cultural exposure and cognitive bias. If God wants a relationship with everyone, why is belief so geographically skewed? Why is the one true faith always what your parents believed? And finally, his claim that we should trust that God has good reasons because he's God is circular. He's assuming the conclusion to defend the problem. As Hitchens said, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
You said that you think that something like the Book of Job speaks to God's tenderness.
Yes, about how God responds to evil and suffering.
Because my interpretation of the Book of Job is that God responds to Job asking, and Job's lucky in the sense that when he asks for a response, for an explanation for his suffering, at least God actually answers him.
Right.
But God doesn't say, hey, take heed, I'm here for you, chill out, it's all cool, I've got a plan for you. He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel?
Gird your loins, man.
Yeah.
Yes,
for I will question you, and you will answer me, as if to say, who do you think you are to deserve an answer here? This doesn't seem very tender to me. This seems like God saying, not only am I going to inflict suffering upon you, and not only am I not going to give you an explanation as to why that suffering is taking place, but who the hell do you think you are to demand an explanation? Mm-hmm. This seems, and the tragic irony of the situation is that, of course, God is saying to Job, implying to Job, well, you can't understand your suffering. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You'll never get this. But the irony is that the reason for Job's suffering is explained to the reader of the book of Job. Right? The author of the book of Job explains to the reader why it is that Job is suffering. He gives the story of why God is inflicting the suffering. And yet the moral of the story is supposed to be, well, Job is suffering, and he could never understand. He could never be in a position to understand. Well, we are, as a reader, it's explained to us in the book, but we're supposed to believe that Job couldn't have understood.
But what happens to Job in the end?
Anger in the end of Job is compensated. He's given like a new wife, as if that's just going to make up for the fact that his old one died. No, again, it's this idea that you can just kind of, he's like, well, he repents in dust and ashes, and then his life is restored, and he lives, a long and happy life. What are we supposed to take from this? A man who gets has all kinds of sufferings inflicted upon him, has these moments of thinking that God isn't what he thought he was. He says, God, how could you do this? God answers him and says, who the hell do you think you are? Job goes, sorry, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry. And then he's all fine again. Where's the tenderness? Where's the compassion? Where's the kind of New Testament readying essence of Job that you were talking about?
Right, well, there's always going to be a balance between, now God could just say, who are you? I can do whatever I want, and then leave him in the ashes. So there's a balance between God in compensating Job and giving him more than what he lost. So giving him more crops, more cattle. Though interestingly,
a better wife, maybe.
No, interestingly enough, the same number of children, because the Bible understands that children are not like property that you can compensate by just giving more of something. That I always thought was an interesting note in the end of the story there, that God brings Job out of this, but at the same time recognizing, and this is hard for us in the modern age where we have no problem speaking to the manager when we're upset about something. That was not a trait in human beings for a long time, of recognizing God's majesty and sovereignty. It's a balancing act that we can go too far and say God is so tender, he doesn't really care about having authority and being just and punishing wrongdoing. And then the other extreme is God is so sovereign, I don't care, I can stomp around because I'm the king. I do believe a right Christian theology can find a balance between the two.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would just add that I wouldn't mind if I was asking God, why is this suffering, including why you're not revealing yourself to me. And it's important. If he just screamed at me, if he just said, well, who the hell are you? I probably would be like, right, oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry, man. Like, I guess I do just repent in dust and ashes and become a Christian.
Are you sure? Really? Really?
Yeah.
You just heard a voice. Given your background knowledge, are you aware of many people who think they hear God, but they don't?
Yes.
How do you know you're not one of them?
Well, I wasn't even making a claim there as to what I like kind of ought to do. I'm just saying I think I would actually do that.
Okay.
I think I kind of wouldn't have a problem with that. My criticism there was just of you describing God as kind of being tender.
And also it's important when we look at like the biblical witness.
The book of Job is often cited to show God's wisdom or justice. But under scrutiny, it exposes a deeply flawed moral framework. Job's suffering wasn't punishment or the result of free will. It was collateral damage in a wager between God and Satan. That's not divine love. That's cosmic cruelty. And the idea that Job is eventually compensated with new children misses the point. Psychological studies, including work published in The Lancet Psychiatry, show that the loss of a child causes trauma that no material restoration can erase. Children aren't livestock. Replacing them doesn't erase grief. Then there's the issue of God's response to Job. Where were you when I created the earth? This isn't an explanation. It's a power move. It's the kind of reasoning you'd expect from a dictator, not a moral exemplar. In modern ethics, the burden of justification lies with the one causing harm, not the one suffering. But the Bible reverses this. It asks the victim to justify their pain. Worse, this authoritarian tone is repeated across Scripture. In 1 Samuel 15, God commands genocide. In Deuteronomy 21, rebellious children are to be stoned. These aren't metaphors. They're moral codes of an Iron Age tribe, not universal principles. And when Christians appeal to the whole picture of Scripture, citing verses like 1 Peter 5:7 about casting your anxiety on God, it doesn't erase the abuse elsewhere. If a text has to be selectively read and the violence constantly reinterpreted, it's not divine. It's propaganda. From a psychological standpoint, the desire to find meaning in suffering is deeply human. Viktor Frankl wrote about this in Man's Search for Meaning. But recognizing suffering and assigning it a reason are not the same. Religion hijacks this instinct, offering answers that comfort rather than confront reality. The atheist explanation is simpler and more honest. Suffering exists because nature is indifferent, not intentional. The evolutionary process has no goal, no morality. It just selects what survives. This view doesn't make suffering easier, but it makes it comprehensible. We don't need to invent a cruel God to explain pain. We just need to accept reality.
The entire picture about it has to be looked at in a whole.
Yes.
So, I mean, some episodes or passages of Scripture will reveal some aspects of God. For example, the Old Testament authors were extremely concerned about defending God's sovereignty, because they'll say, well, look, you think your God is so great. He lets this bad thing happen. He lets Pharaoh enslave you. And the Old Testament author is saying, no, our God, Yahweh, he is the God of gods. He is sovereign over everything. And so they're really emphasizing that. Whereas then in maybe other aspects of the Bible, we read like in 1 Peter, we cast all our anxieties upon him. We have to look at the whole picture. But
Christianity asks us to believe that genocide, silence, suffering, and randomness are all part of a plan. But the evidence shows a chaotic, amoral universe where humans are left to find meaning on their own. That's not a failure of faith. That's a sign of intellectual honesty. Question and call to action. If a God existed and truly loved us, would the world look like this? Or are we better off taking responsibility for each other without waiting on invisible voices? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more videos that unpack the logic behind belief and why we don't need it to live moral, meaningful lives, make sure to like, subscribe, and share.
My doctoral studies at the University of Birmingham, we came to have a warm affection for this country and her people, and I consider it a real joy and a delight to be here with you tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now, I'll leave it up to Dr. Atkins to present his arguments for atheism before I respond to them. In this opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 3 lines of evidence that weigh in favor of God's existence. As a professional philosopher, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including philosophical, scientific, moral, and historical considerations. Number 1, then, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why anything at all exists rather than nothing? Did the universe have a beginning? Or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, to call into question that assumption. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give just one example, suppose you had an actually infinite number of coins numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. And suppose I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So, infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any result from 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world in which we live, such a convention has no sway. Obviously, you can give away any coins that you want. Here's another example of the absurdity of an infinite past. Take the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Suppose that for every orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. If Saturn has completed 10 orbits, Jupiter has completed 20. If Saturn has completed 1 trillion, Jupiter has completed 2 trillion. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, then they will approach a limit at which Saturn will be infinitely far behind Jupiter. But now turn the story around. Suppose that Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Now, which will have completed the most number of orbits? The correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the further the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical just by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe. But
William Lane Craig opens by asking a question few want to touch. Why is there something rather than nothing? For him, both logic and science point to one answer. The universe had a beginning, and things that begin don't just pop into existence uncaused. He points to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which makes it clear, even if there are multiple universes, all signs still point to a starting line. No eternal past, no infinite timeline, just a beginning that demands an explanation. Peter Atkins, representing the atheist view, leans hard on science, suggesting that the universe could arise from nothing. But that nothing isn't really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum governed by laws, math, and energy. That's a something hiding behind a label. Of course, Craig doesn't let it slide. If the universe began, and that vacuum isn't truly nothing, then what triggered existence itself? You can sidestep the question. You can rename the problem. But at some point, you have to face it. Either everything came from absolutely nothing, or something beyond the universe started it all. Let's see where Atkins takes it from here.
I think we should agree that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you, Professor Craig. Can I ask Professor Atkins now to give his opening presentation?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. My immediate task, of course, is to set up my stall, not to respond to Dr. Craig's arguments at this stage. That will come later, although, as you will see, some of my remarks now will in fact touch upon what he has just raised. In fact, my task is to bring you forward from the 11th century, where you've been immersed with considerable erudition for the past 20 minutes, and bring you into the 21st century, and to present arguments based on 1,000 years of increasing knowledge about the world. Dr. Craig would have been a wonderful medieval apologist, and it's a pleasure to hear his erudite reprise, with a few elaborations, of course, of what could have been said 1,000 years ago. I do not say that scornfully. Dr. Craig has touched on arguments that have long troubled thinkers, believers, and disbelievers alike, and their longevity underlines their importance to mankind. But first, an admission. I cannot prove that God does not exist. Everything there is could be the creation of an extraordinary entity that surpasses our understanding. It could be that the universe was created only a millisecond ago, with all our memories suddenly but falsely in place. It could be, as God is outside time, whatever that meaningless phrase means, that he hasn't decided even to make us yet. It's just conceivable that God did indeed create the universe 13.7 billion years ago. I cannot prove that he did not. All I can do is to assemble evidence that leads to the conclusion that God is not necessary for any aspect of the current world, and that there is a far simpler explanation for everything than the assertion of the existence of an omnipotent God. I have to say, of course, that many hold that the assertion that God made it is far, far simpler as an explanation of everything than a more pedestrian account in terms of physical laws. God, they say, is surely a simpler explanation than complex mechanism. Don't be seduced. The assertion that God did anything is simplistic rather than simple, and it is lazy. It is simplistic because an entity as functionally unbounded as a God must be of extraordinary complexity. It is lazy because it avoids becoming involved in untangling the web of events that have led to us. Any argument that simply asserts that God did it is a sign of a lazy mind, a mind that is content to wallow in assertion rather than embark upon climbing the intellectual Everest of comprehension. My argument against God is that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained in prospect at least, without invoking that complex hypothesis. In other words, there are simpler explanations, or at least the prospect of simpler explanations, for absolutely everything. Because there are simpler explanations, or the prospect of them, there is no need to burden our understanding with the assertion that there is something more, namely an incomprehensible God. That billions of people believe to the contrary is of no consequence. Truth is not arrived at by majority vote. There are clearly huge psychological and cultural pressures imposed on people from an early age, and belief has been honed by the powerful into a potent weapon of crowd control. In the nasty, brutish brevity of an impoverished life, great comfort comes from the belief that there is better to come. There is also satisfaction that wrongdoers, wealthy perhaps on earth, will get their comeuppance in the afterlife. Even the meek are in with a chance. Angst and hope, angst at the prospect of one's own annihilation, and hope for unbounded ecstasy to come are potent drivers into the jaws of belief. But the potency of the drivers and the huge majority of the hoopers does not mean that the belief is correct. I've made a strong but carefully worded claim that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained or has the prospect of being explained without invoking a God. I need to justify that claim. If you accept my argument that a God is unnecessary, then your only recourse, if you insist on believing that there is a God, is to admit that you are driven by your heart rather than your head. But hearts are unreliable organs of knowledge. I shall deal with 6 points: contingency, fitness, purpose, miracles, including resurrections, theodicy, and morality. Obviously, and perhaps mercifully, I don't have time to be thorough on any of these topics, but perhaps by setting out the ground, we can turn to finer arguments later. In each case, I shall argue that modern science, the agent of the new Enlightenment, promises, I can offer no more than that, to elucidate what theology has long obscured. First, contingency. Science currently doesn't have the slightest clue about how a universe can come into existence out of absolutely nothing without intervention. I will leave aside whether the universal is eternal in some sense and without a beginning. That's something to be determined by observation, not by the ruminations of philosophy. We simply don't know. To make it harder for myself, I shall suppose for the sake of argument that there was a beginning. But there are 2 kinds of beginning, and it's important to distinguish them. One type of beginning is when an already existing universe gives rise to a daughter universe. Another type of a beginning is when absolutely nothing turns into a universe. I should call that latter universe an original universe. Now, as you've just heard, some assert that a universe can spring from a quantum fluctuation. That may be true of a daughter universe, for an already existing mother universe has physical laws and a richly propertied vacuum. But when there is absolutely nothing, there are no physical laws, no quantum fluctuation. It's an empty term for the emergence of an original universe. And to make things harder for myself, but with an eye on trying to answer and not evade a deeply important question, I shall set aside the simpler problem of a daughter universe and consider the formation of an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality, which is essentially the working out of the consequences of physical laws, to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event. And what science has to do, in due course, is to discover how absolutely nothing can tumble into being and become apparently something. Is there any reason to believe that it might succeed? There's no doubt that it's actually edging towards that goal by burrowing back in time to discover that there was what there was immediately after the creation event. Look how far it has come in the past 100 years. We are starting to be confident about what first appeared.
Peter Atkins begins with a clear position. The existence of God cannot be disproven, but the concept is not required to explain the universe. His argument rests on the view that every observable phenomenon can, in principle, be understood through natural processes. There is no need to introduce a supernatural cause when the available tools of science already address the questions once reserved for theology. In physics, the origin of the universe is explored through models based on quantum field theory and general relativity. Physicists such as Edward Tryon, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth have developed frameworks in which a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum. These models are grounded in established physical principles and published in peer-reviewed contexts. They examine conditions where space, time, matter, and energy do not yet exist in classical forms. The quantum vacuum in these models is not empty space, but a pre-geometric state governed by probabilistic fluctuations. It has no particles or fields in the classical sense, but it permits spontaneous events due to its underlying structure. This is not a speculative leap. It is derived from the mathematics used to describe quantum systems and is consistent with the theoretical foundations of modern cosmology. Experimental advancements continue to inform these models, including those from particle accelerators, satellite measurements of the cosmic microwave background, and high-precision gravitational data. Physical laws, in this view, are not prescriptive forces imposed from outside. They describe regularities that emerge as physical systems develop. The law-like behavior observed in nature reflects consistent patterns rather than imposed order. Causality, time, and space are not treated as eternal categories but as emergent properties tied to the structure of the system. Atkins also addresses ethics and human behavior. Moral norms, cooperation, and legal structures are developed through social interaction, negotiation, and institutional memory. These systems function through accountability, shared understanding, and revision, not through appeals to divine authority. Global studies show that societies without strong religious frameworks continue to build systems that address justice, welfare, and civil order through public mechanisms. Historically, many institutions that shape human rights, medicine, and law have emerged through empirical inquiry and political struggle, rather than from sacred texts. Legislative assemblies, universities, courts, and scientific academies operate through transparent procedures and ongoing correction. Changes in legal rights, bodily autonomy, and freedom of expression were often developed through public debate, not religious mandate.
I'd like to perhaps paraphrase a remark by the economist J.K. Galbraith, who said that astrology was invented in order to make economic forecasting look respectable. I'd like to say that theology was invented to make philosophy look respectable. You've heard nothing but obfuscation. Let me remind you, because I have to, my first rebuttal refers to the first 20 minutes of Dr. Craig's presentation, rather than his immediate one. The level of argument that we heard relating to the eternal nature of the universe. It was that planets clearly have not been going round the sun an infinite number of times. I shorten the rather ludicrous argument that we actually heard. No one ever says that. He's raised a straw man. What we're really concerned about is whether the universe itself is infinite. And we can measure the life of the solar system as about 5 billion years. We can measure the life of the universe as 13.7 billion years. We weren't talking about that at all. We were talking about whether the sequence of universes might be infinite and that there was never actually a beginning. You cannot argue against that by philosophy. You cannot argue against that by theology. The only way you can argue about it is by looking at the evidence, and we heard no evidence whatsoever. And arguments about infinity are always extraordinarily doubtful. I mean, Professor Craig said that an infinite number of events has never occurred in the universe. I refer him to Zeno, halving the distance again, never getting anywhere. But clearly, if you've got an infinite number of halving of the distances, you get anywhere you want to. So never listen to an argument about infinity. It's infinitely slippery. The travesty of my remarks about nothing coming from nothing. Let me take that as an example. What I wanted to show is that science is circumspect in the way that it approaches the great questions of being. Okay, it looks around, and if you're a naive looker arounder, a philosopher, a theologian, a gardener, a farmer, you will see a huge amount of energy in the universe, and you will marvel at God's bounty. But then, as a scientist, you think again, and you say, yes, I can measure the amount of energy in the universe. I won't just lie back and think about it. I will measure it, because once I put numbers to ideas, they become testable and verifiable. And to determine the energy of the universe, the first thing I do is to weigh it. So I weigh the mass, I determine the mass of a galaxy, and then I multiply it by the square of the speed of light. And through E equals mc squared, I get the energy that that galaxy represents. I do it for this galaxy, that galaxy, this galaxy, every galaxy in the universe, not just the ones we can see. And I get a colossal value. And I lie back and wonder at God's munificence. And then I say, but I've forgotten something, which is the gravitational attraction between galaxies. And whenever you have two attracting bodies, they lower their energy. And if you take the gravitational attraction of this galaxy with that one, it lowers that first sum we got a little bit. Then this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one. And the signs are, and we're not completely certain about this, because we do not jump to conclusions in science. We are circumspect, imaginative, and honest. We find that that gravitational attraction reduces that original huge energy we had to zero. In other words, God's munificence was zero. And you don't need a God if the God isn't going to give you anything. What science does is to simplify the questions that need to be answered. It doesn't say, there was nothing originally, there's nothing now. What it does is to simplify the question that needs to be asked. We're moving cautiously, imaginatively, and reliably to understanding the incipience of the universe by identifying what questions truly have to be answered. There is nothing here, I will concede that, but it's an extremely interesting form of nothing. There was nothing originally. There is nothing here now, but it's through whatever event took place at the inception of the universe, it became an interesting form of nothing, which seems to be something. It may be metaphysical, and it may sound stupid, But what I'm doing is identifying the question that needs to be answered, not just sitting back in awe and saying, look at the universe, fantastic job, it obviously needed someone really rather special to do it. The resurrection, if I can jump forward, I do notice that Professor Craig, although I made 6 points, did not deal with all 6. Perhaps I should deal with all 3 of his. His second, of course, was the objectivity of moral values. To say that you cannot be moral without a God is frankly disgusting. I am moral. I do not believe that I am guided by a God. And I think it casts a slur on atheists everywhere in the world to presume that they are evil because they believe there is no God. Morals, as I asserted in my opening presentation, the emergence of morals should be understood. They should not simply be accepted. You should try to find the roots of moral behavior, hard as it is to trace the emergence of moral thinking as one's own body begins at 1 cell and turns into 1 trillion cells as evolution proceeds through billions of years, as people begin to think about the consequences of their actions. That's the way to understand morality, not just to lie back and think that there is an umpire in the sky somewhere. Try to understand. All I'm saying is that it is healthier to understand. If Voltaire said in one of my favorite quotations that people who believe in absurdities commit atrocities. And I think we see that in religious belief, where atrocities are affected in the name of dogma. The resurrection, I must deal with that in miracles. Of course, David Hume got it right when he said that there's always more reason to disbelieve the report than there is to believe what is reported. Look at the Gospels. You can't really believe it. Pretend we were writing about events 60 years ago when there was no actual real record. We wouldn't get it right. We'd make up a lot of it. The Gospels are political propaganda sheets. And it's inevitable and understandable that they were invented to make the point that they were trying to make. Yes, Joshua, if he existed, Jesus, I suppose you might call him, and I can well believe that in the Palestine of 2,000 years ago, there were lots of Joshuas around, that was probably a very nice man, and was certainly written up to be a very nice man by the people compiling the Gospels to establish the creed that they wanted to. But the actual evidence is extremely slender. The evidence in favor of an actual resurrection is compiled by those who start from a prejudicial point of view that it did occur and then seek to justify it. Others, those who deny the resurrection, say, this is such an extraordinary event, we need real extraordinary evidence to support it. And there is no real extraordinary evidence to support it. So why should you believe it? Because you can see that it was invented as a political manifesto? No, you cannot possibly believe it. And all this gibberish about having to justify atheism, I mean, that's another example of false premise. If I come into a room and say, I don't understand anything, I will start from the simplest explanation, and I will let you convince me.
Peter Atkins lays out 2 key points, both grounded in what science and history actually show. First, the claim that the universe requires a divine beginning doesn't match how cosmology works. Physicists like Edward Tryon and Alexander Vilenkin have developed models showing that a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum, a state with no classical matter, space, or time. This isn't a loophole. It's a real possibility supported by quantum field theory, the same framework that underpins much of modern physics. In this framework, the total energy of the universe, once gravitational effects are included, may balance to zero. If that's the case, then the question of where the energy came from doesn't even need to be asked. There's no debt, no transaction, just a starting point that unfolds through known physical principles. Second, morality doesn't require belief in a deity to exist or to function. Human behavior, cooperation, and ethical reasoning can be traced through evolution, social dynamics, and shared experience. Data from Pew and Gallup show that people in non-religious societies still support justice, fairness, and care for others. Atkins doesn't reject meaning or mystery. He rejects the idea that those things need to be filled with untestable claims. When it comes to miracles like the resurrection, the same principle applies. Claims that break natural patterns require more than tradition. They need evidence. Where do you stand? Do you think morality depends on religion, or can we shape ethics and compassion without it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this gave you ideas, be sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep the conversation going.